welcome to the September 2024 edition of TrustMasters Monthly. Today, we are so excited to welcome a very special guest to talk about a topic that I think is very near and dear to most of your hearts, which is CMMC. The special guest that we intend to welcome, you'll see on screen with me, Matt Bruggeman. Matt, welcome. Thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me, Patrick. I'm very excited to be here, very excited to talk CMMC. I know it's a very hot topic right now. So yeah, I'm eager to just help however I can here.
Well, and that being said, let me say to the audience, first of all, a piece of housekeeping that I tend to forget every month, so I apologize. We do have a Q&A section that you'll see on your screen. As you have questions, please feel free to input those questions into the Q&A, and we'll be sure, time permitting, that we cover as many of those questions at the end of our session or via follow-up after the fact. So please, if you do have questions, let us know. We're happy to address as best we can. Now, that said, Matt, as you and I kind of talked about the best way to unpack this topic that is CMMC, I think we both kind of landed on this idea that approaching via the reporter's questions, who, what, when, where, why, might be the best thing just to ensure we cover all of our bases. Yeah, that said, maybe we start a little bit out of order and focus on the what. If I could just ask you, to the best of your ability in English, plain English, what is CMMC? I mean, help us understand if you.
I will, and I'm glad you asked for English because I don't speak any other languages. So I'm happy to give a high-level overview. What is CMMC? Let's start there. I think at its very basic, let's define it as an acronym. There will be a lot of acronyms here today, as anytime we talk about federal government regulations and compliance. So it is an acronym. It stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So already some of the words in CMMC themselves kind of lend itself towards kind of some clues as to what it is, why it's here, what's kind of the purpose. So really what CMMC is the Department of Defense's method for ensuring and validating that their entire supply chain, all of their prime and subcontractors, often referred to as the Defense Industrial Base, the DIB. It's their way to ensure that they are protecting any sensitive data that flows down into them through their contract, through the work that they're doing through their contracts, right? So federal contract information, FCI, and that's one you'll hear a lot, and controlled unclassified information, CUI, that's an acronym you'll see a lot. So at its very basic, it is a method that the DoD put together and put forth to really validate that the sensitive data, CUI or FCI, that they are, sending to these contractors in order to perform the work that they've contracted them for, that it is being protected. It's not getting into our adversaries' hands.
And Matt, as you mentioned the Defense Industrial Base, my mind goes back to really what at this point feels like an older standard, which is DFARS. And it seems like DFARS really leaned into NIST SB 800-171. Is CMMC fundamentally different than what we would have seen in the past? Is this something brand new?
Yeah, it's a great question. So really, if you look at kind of to date and a little bit historically, everybody in that DoD supply chain, the DIB, their current requirements, if you handle this sensitive data, you will see a clause. You just mentioned it, DFARS clause. You'll see a few DFARS clauses. Basically, what they point to is meet the control framework, NIST Special Publication 800-171. There's 110 controls in there. They're basically saying, hey, you need to be compliant with those controls. And then in other DFARS regulations, they outline how you need to self-attest and show that you are meeting that requirement. Well, that's been around for a few years, and we're kind of getting into the why now a little bit. Why did this come about? Well, it kind of lends itself towards that. So as you can see, there may be some issues with kind of that trusting self-attestation model among hundreds of thousands of organizations. And I think over the years, we've seen through different, specific plans and things like that. But basically, it's not working, right? So some of the sensitive data is clearly falling into the hands of our adversaries, and they are catching up in terms of some of the research or the work that they do within the DoD. So they basically said, hey, we need to put together a more mature model, that first M in CMMC, and we need to certify, right? CMMC certification. So basically what this is doing, it's not adding any new control requirements. It's basically adding a verification method. It's basically saying, hey, Instead of relying on that self-attestation, let's get a third-party auditor to come in and assess you against those 110 NIST 800 171 controls. And let's have them issue a stamp of approval, that CMMC certification, so that we can have some validation and some assurance that you're actually meeting these control frameworks and that our sensitive data is actually being protected when we send it out to our DIB.
And man, it kind of in that context, this really doesn't feel as overwhelming as I thought it might. I mean, essentially what you're saying is the market, the defense industrial base, has already been bound to these obligations. What we're layering in and what is fundamentally net new is it's no longer self-attestation, but we're looking for independent third-party certification that the controls are actually being employed and used in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And I think that is a really important point to stress, because I think there is a lot of, or has been a lot of questions or potential pushback, especially from smaller organizations that are in the supply chain and basically saying, hey, this would be extra burdensome for us. And the DoD has pointed back and kind of pushed back on a lot of that and saying, hey, we're not telling you that you need to put extra time, money, effort into implementing these controls, because it's in your current contract requirements that those controls are implemented, right? So it's really just about the cost for certification that the DoD factors in when they think about the added costs of this program as a whole.
And then, Matt, along those lines, we've talked about what, we've talked about why. Before we do talk about certification, maybe we focus on the when. Is there a line in the sand? Is there a time beyond which this requirement is no longer just a good idea, but a real requirement to do business?
Definitely. When is kind of the big question right now. And I know I've referred to CMMC as the kind of the boy who cried wolf sort of moment. I know for what, 4 or 5 years, a lot of you have probably been hearing the term CMMC. You've been hearing, oh, CMMC is about to come, the requirements are about to come, and then we've seen little to nothing. So I think people have grown a little callous to hearing it, right? They're hearing the boy cry wolf again and saying, oh, it's just this again. But what I would like to hopefully really convince you all, anybody listening, and show is that this time it's for real. Without going into the weeds too much into what went on previously, the long story short, in terms of when CMMC will be required, it falls into, there's two main sort of rules that kind of put together CMMC as a program and the implementation of it. The federal government has a rulemaking process, right? And so one of them that is especially relevant whenever you hear about the CMMC rule, people are generally referring to the 32 CFR rule. What that is the rule that actually finalizes the CMMC program as a whole, right? So think, what is it? What are the control requirements? What are the different levels? Like, who has to do it? Who assesses against it? How do they assess? All those sorts of things. What is this program as a whole? They've been working on that for years, and it's been going through the often cumbersome, red tape laden federal process, right?
Rulemaking process, I think, is what.
Rulemaking process. But we are really at the end of that right now, and I couldn't stress enough how much we are literally right at the end of it. Like, the final rule could be published while we're on this webinar. That's how imminent it is. So it recently passed the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs review. They've completed their review, and that's really the last step. They're really just tidying everything up at this point, kind of finalizing format, and then it's going to be published in the Federal Register, that final program rule. When it does, you guys will be seeing a ton about that, I'm sure, everywhere. Everybody will be writing, about what it is, what does this mean, all those sorts of things. And the one thing I want to stress is, as soon as that rule is published, it does not mean it is effective day of, right? There is a period before they will say, hey, the program begins effectiveness on X date, right? So in the final rule, they will state X business days or X days, calendar days from now is when the rule becomes effective. And that's going to be a really critical date for all of us to keep our eyes on when the rule is published here any day now. And I think as we get into the weeds a little bit more, I can talk about that second rule and the implications that has on contract requirements. But I thought I'd pause there to see if that spurred any more conversation.
Well, and I do. I think about, so I very definitely want to hear about the contractual requirements via the second rule that you're going to discuss.
Yeah.
But the mind immediately goes to just economics, supply and demand. And it feels as if we're going to have a line in the sand where everyone in the defense industrial base, and I don't know what that count is. I imagine it's pretty significant.
Yeah, it's over 200,000. Yeah.
Wow. So a significant number of people needing a particular service, in this case, certification. Are there that many C3 PAOs operating today? Are there that many organizations like us that can actually fulfill that need? Or do you see a bottleneck somewhere in this process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just to kind of hammer home that point a little bit more. So A-LIGN, we are a C3PAO, that's CMMC third-party assessment organization. So that is the kind of the new bodies that the CMMC or that the DoD put together to kind of help verify, right? We are the organizations that come in and assess you against those controls, and we give you that CMMC certification. Now, on the numbers of organizations affected, this kind of goes into the who a little bit, right? There's over 200,000 organizations within the defense industrial base. Now, one thing we didn't touch on, we didn't dive too deep. I'm wanting to keep this relatively high level, but we didn't go into the kind of the details of the what quite yet. But just to touch on that, because it's going to be relevant, there are 3 levels to CMMC, right? It's level 1, level 2, and level 3. They kept it nice and plain and simple for us.
Oh,
Level 1 is if you're touching federal contract information, which if you are contracted in that supply chain, it's kind of inherent. You have a contract with them, you're going to be touching FCI. If you're in level 1, you only have to continue to self-attest. There is no third-party assessment requirement. And
wow.
there's a different number of requirements you need to meet, a lot less. It's only 17 practices that you need to self-attest a meeting. So then when you look at level 2, there's going to be an estimated 75 to 80,000 of those total 200 plus. 75 to 80,000 organizations are going to fall into needing that level 2 CMMC certification. And what the bar is for that, Patrick, is if you touch any controlled unclassified types that we deal with here, again, just to reiterate, the FCI, CUI. If you're not touching CUI, level 1, if you are touching CUI, that'll bump you into level 2, and that's when you'll need a CMMC certification from a third party like A-LIGN. Back to your original question now, there's only around 60 C3PAOs currently. Around 80,000 organizations that'll need a certification. Simple math tells you, immediately that's not going to go well in terms of the number of people who can assess for that work. Now, there's some nuance there, right? There continues to be more and more C3PAOs every day, so that will certainly continue to grow. And not all 80,000 are going to get certified on the same day or in the same month, but there is still an anticipated backlog and bottleneck that we foresee of all the organizations that rightfully so are going to want to get certified before it shows up in their contract requirements, and the number of organizations and personnel just available to actually perform that work.
And Matt, as I think about this, it is very, at least in my experience, it's very uncommon for a single organization to manage all the services that they need to manage. Most organizations, in my experience, focus on their core business, and then we'll bring in outside vendors, service providers, to deliver on core functionality that they just don't have expertise for. So as we think about CMMC certification and the defense industrial base, will service providers for those in the DIB also need certification? Does that burden transition to them as well?
It does. So this is a really good question. So this again gets into the who is affected by this. So those numbers we touched on, we're looking directly at who's in the defense industrial base, right? Are you a prime or subcontractor on a DoD contract? But to your point, there's something called out in CMMC, external service providers, ESPs, and there's different types of external service providers, right? There's cloud service offerings, but there's also, more commonly you'd see something like an MSP or an MSSP, right? A managed service provider. To your point, very commonly used. Let me outsource that work. I'm focusing on my core business.
Yep.
And they are in scope. So basically, CMMC kind of outlines how the level that you are at, the sensitive data you're touching. If your MSP is touching and providing security for those types of assets, then they need to be certified at or above that level as well. So what we're seeing are a lot of those external service providers selling into the defense industrial base. They're starting to hear about some of these requirements their way as well. And particularly a lot of the managed service providers, this is what they do. So they might be doing this work with a lot of DIB organizations. So they're saying, hey, I really need to make sure that I've got my ducks in a row, that I'm ready and lined up for a C3PAO CMMC assessment so that I can make sure I'm certified so that my clients can continue to use me as they go to get CMMC certified.
My goodness. So that number, again, we see this imbalance, but it almost feels like that imbalance continues to grow quicker than new C3 PAOs can come online to deliver on the need.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to open the open the door for you to elaborate if you wanted to. If you wanted to.
Yeah, no, I mean, to your point, like, we can't necessarily project super accurately anybody. Hey, what are the number of C3POs that are going to come on board per week, per month, and how is that going to meet the demand? Nobody knows for sure. I think eventually over the period of years that'll stabilize. But I think out of the gate, especially with organizations that are going to be looking forward and saying, hey, I don't want to risk even getting close to my contract renewal or the showing up in my contract requirements and me not being certified. I want to make sure that I'm certified before that. I think a majority of organizations are gonna be in that camp. And the other thing I'll say here is I'm already hearing this from a lot of clients that I'm talking to that are subs. The primes are asking about this right now. And when this final 32 CFR rule is published in the Federal Register any day now, that's only going to pick up. And that's gonna enact what we would call kind of the market rollout phase of this. Basically, once that 32 CFR rule becomes effective, that's when C3PAOs can begin those assessments. We can't begin those assessments today, right? The rule isn't finalized, it isn't published. But once that final rule is not only published, but again, effective, we're going to look at that effective date. That's when C3PAOs can begin those assessments. That's when organizations can begin to get certified.
And then, Matt, just to follow up really quickly, something that you began describing earlier, you mentioned two different CFRs, CFR 32, and then it feels like there's a CFR 48 maybe that deals with more specific contractual obligations.
Let's dive into that now. So I kind of mentioned the market rollout phase, right? That's going to
Yes.
happen once the 32 CFR rule is published. Basically, what that means is the market, the clients in the DIB and those affected that need certification, they're going to start, heading towards compliance, getting ready, getting their documentation or basically getting ready for that assessment, and then getting lined up and actually getting assessed by a C3PAO and getting certified. Now, does this 32 CFR rule put it in your DoD contracts? No. To Patrick's point, that's what that other separate rulemaking process is really about. The implementation, enforcement, and requirement of the CMMC program and the CMMC requirements into those DoD contracts. So again, we talked about the rulemaking process can be long and cumbersome. 32 CFR rule is at the very end of that. The 48 CFR rule is just a little bit further back in that process, not too much further back. Current estimates would put it at probably summer of 2025 being finalized itself, but it's a little bit further back in the review process right now. But basically, once that rule gets finalized, 48 CFR, that's when those DoD contract officers and the DoD in general can and will then begin putting it into contract requirements. Now, the one thing, again, the little asterisk I want to put here is it will be a phased rollout. Again, immediately, it's not going to be in all DoD contracts day one. There will be a phased rollout approach. But again, that's kind of the difference. And that's why what we're trying to stress to clients as much as we can right now is try to understand what that timeline looking forward means, particularly with where you're at right now in the process and how long you might need to get ready for that.
And Matt, just to ask the question really for my edification, once the requirement makes it into a contract, regardless of where it is in the phased rollout, is it then the entity's responsibility to offer certification or validation of certification? In effect, do they have any wiggle room after this shows up in one of their contractual agreements, or is it too late at that point?
It is too late at that point. And the important date that it happens at contract award. So that is when the requirement needs to be met. So you need to be CMMC certified, for instance, if you're on a contract that you're handling CUI at the award of the contract would be the date.
Okay. So for organizations, and correct me if I misstate this, but it feels like we've got really two different lines in the sand going on. CFR 32 goes final. That's when organizations that want to maintain their own sense of agency, their own control of the process, can and very likely should begin undergoing certification assessment. We then have 48 CFR, wherein organizations effectively to continue doing business, to continue winning these awards, these contracts, will have to show validation of certification. So in effect, their agency is lost at that point. It's a requirement. Is that fair?
It is fair to say, and that's why I feel like I'm trying to scream from the rooftops here, and a lot of organizations, a lot of people in the space is trying to make people aware that it is real this time. It is not as far away as you think, And it will take you some time to get ready for that. And to your point, Patrick, the reason it's so critical is it will then be a contract requirement. And at the award of the contract, if you do not have whatever the requirement is for level 2 organizations, a certification from a third party auditor, you will not be awarded the contract. So it's as simple as that. So for most organizations, this becomes about not losing existing work that they have, right? A lot of organizations I talk to, they're also in it for, hey, a little bit proactive. Maybe I'm in the defense industrial base now, or I'm selling to them a little bit, or maybe not at all, but I'm wanting to proactively get into that space. That happens. But for most organizations, it's about, hey, I do this work currently. I need to make sure I don't lose it.
Yeah. And then Matt, if you know, if not, that's fine as well. But if you know, what does it actually look like for an organization to get ready? I mean, is this a lengthy process? Is this something they're already likely doing if they've been following 171 and kind of adhering to the DFARS requirements in the past? Is it a big lift, a little lift? I mean, what does this even look like?
Very good question. And you're on the right track. You're thinking very logically here to say, hey, well, you set up top, there's no new controls, so you should be ready, right? Well, what we're finding and what the DoD found, which is the whole point of CMMC, is maybe clients aren't meeting it as much as they maybe say they are or think they are, right? So for most organizations, what we're finding right now is maybe they're not meeting that NIST 800-171 control framework, or maybe they had been in the past, but it just wasn't a perfect score. For CMMC, you will need to pass every practice in order to get certified. So it's slightly different in that aspect. But the other thing is, even if you had been meeting that, maybe your documentation wasn't up to snuff from an outside third-party auditor perspective, right? So that's one thing I try to stress to clients is like, hey, even if you have been without, again, bringing up a new term here, SPURS, SPRS. We can dive into that a little bit if we want, but basically that's the place that you need to go and upload your compliance to 171 currently, and you get a score, a SPURS score out of 110. Even if you feel good about that, you've been submitting that, and you say, hey, we're doing a 110 out of 110. We're doing a 110 out of 110. Basically, you're saying we are compliant. We are ready. I'm often asking those organizations, that's fantastic. Have you ever had a third party auditor come in and validate that and gotten that from their perspective? And I get hit or miss, right? Sometimes they'll say, yeah, I've had somebody come in and do a gap. That's great. Oftentimes I get the answer of no, though. And so I would highly recommend, even if you feel like you're in a good place, third party auditor or somebody to come in and just do like a validation check, a mock audit, a readiness assessment, whatever that might be, could be really valuable. But to your point, I didn't speak on the exact timeline of that yet, Patrick. Again, it really depends. Where are you actually at in that process in terms of compliance to the framework right now and documentation, policies, procedures, that system security plan, all of that stuff to really prove and provide to an auditor that you are meeting that. For most organizations, especially those that are earlier in the process, I mean, it can take 6, 9, 12 months to get ready for this assessment. So it's not a super light lift. Now, again, if you've been preparing for this, you feel like you're in a good place, and maybe there's just a little bit of remediation, maybe that's closer to just a few months, right? Just to make sure that you're getting ready. But I would say for the majority of organizations, the long pull in the tent here is how long do you need until you're really ready for a C3PAO like A-LIGN to come in and assess you?
And then Matt, just to ask, and again, this might be a crystal ball question, but do we foresee 48 CFR, that is the contractual requirements, being more than 12 months out? Or do you think this is more of a pressing need?
So I would say the 48 CFR rule is likely to get finalized the next 12 months. But due to that phased rollout approach, I don't foresee 12 months from now it being in DoD contracts, which that's the good news. It's not going to turn on overnight. But again, I can't stress enough the point that the prime contractors, they're not going to risk their compliance for their subs. They're just not, right? So, and we're already seeing this again before the 32 rule is finalized. Most clients that are coming to us now and asking about CMMC, and I'm saying, hey, how did this come up for you guys? Are you just looking ahead? Did you hear about it? Are you hearing requirements? And a lot of them more and more every day are saying, my prime started to ask me. My prime sent me a questionnaire. Where are you at in the CMMC process? How compliant are you? Because they want to make sure well in advance of it showing up in their contract requirement with the DoD that their entire supply chain is going to be ready.
Yeah, and the supply chain idea, I mean, everywhere we're saying third-party risk management, even fourth-party risk management becoming more and more of a focus. It only makes sense that we would see it here as well. Matt, from an organization perspective, You talked a little bit about what getting ready might look like. I mean, do you have any thoughts on what the assessment might look like? And then honestly, something that I'm ignorant about that I think maybe the listeners would like to hear is this a one and done certification? Are we looking at annual reviews? What does it look like to earn and then maintain a certification for CMMC?
Really, really good point to bring up. So, number one, from the assessment side, yes, in general, we know what those look like. There have been these things called joint surveillance assessments where basically the Department of Defense jointly with C3PAOs, they've been able to audit these organizations. And I'll throw another acronym out there, one you'll see a lot: OSCs, Organization Seeking Certification, or OSA, Organization Seeking Assessment. You'll see both of those a lot.
Okay.
We can jointly audit them now. So a lot of us have been getting practice at what that assessment will actually look like jointly with the DoD. But then even going forward, really what that looks like is, so you need the to get fully assessed, and that gets you your CMMC certification. The good news in all of this, it's a triennial requirement for an assessment, meaning once every 3 years, you need that auditor to come back and assess
Okay.
you. And for those that are more familiar with something like ISO 27001 certification, because that's similar in the aspect that the certification is good for 3 years. Correct me in where I might be wrong there. I'm not an ISO expert, but I know with ISO, there are interim years where you need the auditor to come back and do some work. With CMMC, that is not.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, CMMC, that's not there. So what you do is you get certified year one, year two, you need to self-attest, year three, self-attest, and then you have the auditor come back, issue a new certification that's valid for 3 years.
Okay. And then certification, Matt, is it you did really well? Is it binary? You passed, you failed? I mean, what does that actually look like from a scoring perspective?
Yeah.
And then, and I'm sorry to put this out there, but one of the things that I've seen in some marketing, not necessarily ours, but marketing in general, is the comments about having the most experienced CMMC auditors. And I've really struggled to accept that until you just explained that there are legitimately audits going on right now.
Yes,
So thank you.
yes.
Yeah, thank you
That's
so
a really
much.
good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would wonder, well, how can you be experienced? The rule isn't out. So yes, I will say. Um, so I'm sorry, what was the initial question behind that?
Pass fail. Pass fail. Is there wiggle room? Good, not great. What does this
Yes.
actually look like from an organization?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it is pass fail. So there's 110 practices, is what they would call them. Controls is another word that we would think of, but they call them practices. And within each practice, there's a certain number of practice objectives, right? So from an assessment standpoint, what we're looking at is not just each of those practices that are part of each of the domain families, but we're also looking at each of the objectives under each of those to make sure, and you need to meet each objective within a practice to meet that practice. And you
Okay.
do need to meet every practice by the end of the assessment. So you need a perfect 110. Now, there's some nuance to that, right? There are some findings that you can carry over into a period where you can put them into a poem on certain controls. And then you have a period of time before you can close them out. And then you have the assessor come back in within a certain period of time to validate that you've met them. But by the end of all of that, yes, you need to have met all of the controls in order to get the formal certification.
Okay. And you mentioned POAM, Matt, just for edification, plan of
Yeah.
action and milestones. Is that just a corrective action plan?
Exactly. Yeah. So they have, again, I always this we call this like CMMC 101. I try to not go into the weeds, and then these terms just they pull me in. So the poem, plan of action and milestones. So I mentioned it's only for certain practices, right? So they don't weight all the practices similarly in terms of an actual score. Like when you go in to submit, I mentioned the SPRS. That's the place that you go get a score for your current NIST 800-171 compliance. If you go in right now, they will score either 1, 3, or 5, a value for each of the different practices, and only the ones that are a value of 1 are deemed like less significant. Those are the only ones that you can carry into a poem. So those poems you have to meet at least 80% of overall, but then you could put them into a period where we would come back and then actually come in and assess them.
Okay. Okay. And Matt, really quickly to peel back, because I just got the warning that we've only got about 15 minutes left.
Sure.
So who, what, when, where, why. Have we missed anything critical in painting the picture about what this is, why it's here, what it really needs to look like before we start opening up and responding to some of the questions that we have?
I don't think so, right? I don't think we touched on where too much, but I don't think that's as applicable. We might mark that as NA. Although I do get the question a lot about on-site or not, so maybe that's applicable to where. So we'll talk about how
Yeah.
there are some controls that we will have to come on site for if they are part of your actual scope. And the one thing I want to mention, because it's relevant to this, is CMMC is a very data centric framework, right? So again, the impetus of this is the DoD is sending sensitive data to their contractors. So what do we want to protect? We want to protect that sensitive data. So within your organization, what does your scope look like? Well, it looks like wherever that data flows, right? So one thing that we talk about a lot, particularly in scoping with us, like when clients come to us and they say, hey, I'd love to get in line for your CMMC assessment. Can we get under contract for it now? Side note, yes, we can, and we can start to get you in line, and we can talk about that more. But when we're talking about scoping, or when we're sending them to a readiness partner to help them figure out their scope, where their information flows, often it becomes about, can we mitigate our scope? Can we reduce the people, processes, and technology, the overall assets that are going to be touching this sensitive data? Because that minimizes your scope and that can minimize your overall cost and level of effort in doing something like this. So you'll often hear the term enclave. You might set up a smaller, area where only certain assets are able to even have access to that. Because again, really, as the assessor, what we're mostly looking at is who has access to that, right? Not just who, the people, process, technology, but what assets have access to that sensitive data. So that's a huge factor overall in like timeline, cost. It's very scope dependent, because I do get that question a lot, but it's very scope dependent. And oftentimes I'll ask clients, well, you asked me that, I've got to ask you, where does this data flow within your organization? And I'm not sure. That's not a great sign, right? So that tells me we've got some work to do. You've got to define where this flows so that you can define all of those practices to make sure that you're protecting it wherever it might flow. And then Patrick, before we open it up, maybe just one last thing that I would like to touch on that note is, if this is something where you are at the beginning of the process, I would highly recommend from this, you take some level of action, right? If you are somebody that is going to be affected by this, take some level of action, whether that's a gap, internal, external, just asking around internally, hey, have we been compliant to this? Just try to get a sense for where are you at right now so that we can start to roadmap, and we can certainly help roadmap. What does the path look like going forward? What do I need from my specific organization and where we're at and what our end goal is? And that's what we're really good at. And what we're seeing a lot of clients want right now, again, is to make sure they stay ahead of the curve. They stay ahead of the upcoming requirements. They stay ahead of the upcoming bottleneck. And they want to actually get under contract with the C3PAO to basically get in queue and get in our line. And we've just recently begun doing that. So the good news is our backlog is not massive at this point, because we've just relatively recently started contracting, but we are getting more and more interest every day. So I would urge you, if that's something where you're in a position to do, I think that could be very advantageous.
And for what it's worth, I really want to echo that call to action. I think we've all seen that time slips away much quicker than we would ever hope that it would. It's just the reality of things. But Matt, to that end, and as we do transition kind of over to some of the questions that we've gotten, one of the things as an organization we coach other organizations on is really leveraging overlap of existing control frameworks and existing certifications and attestations, existing standards to build an efficiency in compliance programs. One of our first questions is really just asking, how much overlap is expected from, say, a FedRAMP ready to a CMMC level 2? Is there an opportunity to leverage what's already in place in that documentation to be successful in undergoing your CMMC certification?
Yeah, really good question. So from FedRAMP Ready, I would say more so maybe than other frameworks. So again, without getting into the nitty gritty too much here, so FedRAMP is based off of NIST 853, right? Pulling controls from NIST 853. It's cloud computing specific, it's specific to cloud service offerings, but NIST 800-171, same thing. It's this kind of a subset of 853, right? So yeah. So if you're aligning yourself towards 853 in any way, whether that's through FedRAMP, through FSMA requirements, whatever that might be, that can be a really good starting point for 800-171/CMMC compliance. With the other frameworks, we see that a little bit less. I tell clients this just in general, NIST can be a little bit more prescriptive than your like SOC 2s of the world and things like that. So the overlap is maybe a little bit less, but I like the example you gave, because the other thing is documentation is a little bit different. So I mentioned it briefly, but you need to put together a system security plan, an SSP, which kind of outlines, a lot of your compliance here, along with policies and procedures like that. Similarly, if you're doing FedRAMP, you've got an SSP, right? So that can be a good starting point in a lot of ways.
And Matt, not a question, that this really just came to mind as you were talking about this. And are you aware of any dialogue around reciprocity between FedRAMP and CMMC, or is that nothing that's been part of any conversation you've been part of?
It's a good question. So something I almost touched on in the last question is, we have to talk about scope, right? Is the scope the same? So whenever I get questions about overlap, I always question back, well, is the scope the same? Are we talking about the same scope here? And when you look at FedRAMP versus CMMC, FedRAMP, again, it's really specific to cloud service offerings, right? That's what you get FedRAMP authorized. You don't get an organization FedRAMP authorized. You get a cloud service offering, a product FedRAMP authorized. So you look at CMMC, as I touched on, it's data centric. Where does that data flow and who has access to that? It's just a little bit different than something like FedRAMP. And, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it's a different focus. That makes total sense.
Yeah, yeah. And there is something, I don't want to touch on too much, but this whole question around FedRAMP moderate or equivalent for cloud service offerings. There's a lot of pushback and drama around that right now. But basically, the long and short of it, really briefly, is I talked on how if you're getting CMMC certified, you need to make sure that certain external service providers might be, like, one of them that they touch on is security protection assets, SPAs. That's one of the types of assets. If there's an asset providing security protections to your system, even if they're not touching CUI, they're in scope and or need to be CMMC certified. So when you look at external service providers like a cloud service offering, as is written right now, it states those need to be FedRAMP moderate authorized products or equivalent. Those are the only options. Now, a lot of people foresee that changing to what? We don't know. How far back are they going to roll that requirement? A little bit TBD on that right now. That's why I don't want to touch on it too much, but I thought I would just mention it.
No, understood. I understood. Thank you. Thank you for offering more clarity for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Another question that seems to have gotten some interest in our Q&A. Matt, you talk about this backlog and this recognition, and I assume the recognition is more than just the market saying that there's more work to be done than can be done by C3PAOs. Due to that backlog, is there any talk of having a grace period for businesses that can show that they're contracted with a C3PAO who maybe have yet to do the certification process?
That is a good question. Nothing that I know of right now. I think we're going to have to see how the timelines actually play out, particularly with the 48 CFR rule. When does that rule get enacted and effective that starts to put it in the DoD contract requirements? Because the other thing is that rule will further define what is that phased rollout. When will it start showing up in what DoD contracts, right? So I think we'll have a lot more clarity and good questions to follow up from that. Though if you're really interested in this right now, where that rule is at in the process right now is they've issued a proposed rule. So you can go read what the proposed rule is right now. And I'm pretty sure there's about 2 weeks left on the public comment period. So if you have a thought on this, you can go to that right now and you can leave your public comment. You can read it and leave any comments that you want for the DoD to consider as they finalize the actual rule.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have time for probably one more question.
Okay.
And this is really related to relationships. What will be required for small subcontractors used by prime contractors? Will small entities, even solopreneurs that are contracting with primes, or even contracting with other subs who contract for primes, will everyone in that chain be bound to the same requirements as it relates to CMMC certification and appropriate leveling?
So it depends. That's a fun concern answer, right? So what it depends on, again, data centric. Let's go back to that. What data are they sending to you? So the short answer is yes. But the longer answer is it depends on what their requirements are for you, right? So if a prime contractor or somebody above you is handling controlled and classified information as part of fulfilling their contract, but then they sub out work to you, but then that controlled and classified information, that data, they do not send to you. They just have a contract with you and they only place federal contract information requirements on you. Then you only have to meet level one. So it's really
Yeah.
about the data that flows to you wherever you're at in that chain.
And the next direct relationship. Is that a fair way to put it? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So if they were handing me some of their CUI as part of work doing with them, then yeah, that requirement would flow down to me as well.
Yep. And then Matt, I think we do have time for one more. And I apologize if we don't get a chance to fully answer this.
Sure.
Um, is there a gap analysis tool that can be done to see what additions are needed if an organization already has a standard certification like an ISMS certification for ISO 27001? Is there like a gap that can be performed by us, by someone else, an automated
Yeah.
tool that allows organizations to really know where they stand?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll say a couple things. So number one, there's levels of options here. I think the question was specifically around a tool. Yes, and we have had, if any of you are current clients of ours, you're familiar with Ascend. That's our platform that we use. It's our evidence collection platform. It has some other cool features in it as well, including some kind of tools that you can go along and do some sort of self questionnaire style sort of gaps within. So that's kind of the base level. But then the more advanced level is certainly we could come in and do a gap assessment. We won't look at maybe every control objective or every practice objective in every practice. And we're not gonna. It's not gonna be the same full scope as a full CMMC assessment. It can be if you want us to be, but what we can do is we can basically come in and do a lighter sort of a validation readiness gap. Though if the questions seem to imply, hey, I'm ISO 27001 certified, I don't know how far off I am. I would recommend you go over to like a readiness practitioner organization, an RPO, somebody who specializes in consulting or advising to help you do a gap, and then they'll help you to remediate those gaps. Where A-LIGN can best fit in is once you get a little bit further down the road, you feel like you're in a pretty good place and you want to get, hey, from a C3PAO's perspective, what's their take on my compliance? Because they're going to be the ones, giving me that pass or fail. We can come in and do a mock audit, right? So we can come in and do a mock audit and tell you from a C3PO perspective what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong before we do the actual audit. I call it like taking a pre-SAT before the SAT. Let's just make sure we're in a good place, right? Have we been interviewed? Have we had to produce the right type of evidence? Have we been tested in the right way that a C3PAO will? Probably not. So it's probably advantageous, again, to not delay this any further and risk failing your full assessment. Just do a mock audit with a C3PAO.
And then, Matt, not a question that was asked here, but as you're talking about these readiness organizations, I know with FedRAMP, in order to maintain objectivity, impartiality, as a 3PAO, we're very limited in the feedback that we can give. And so for organizations that really need hand-holding and building systems from scratch, building their compliance from scratch, building their opinion from scratch, we do bring in readiness organizations to ensure that we're, in effect, not auditing our own work. Is it the same with CMMC, just to ask?
It is. I meant to mention that, so I'm glad you brought that up. It is the same. So we cannot impede our independence as a C3PAO. If we want to be your assessor that issues that C3PAO level 2 certification, and we do, we cannot come in and do any consulting or advising work because that would impede our independence. So because of that, we do have, different partners in the space. We can certainly point you in the right direction and give you some different options to talk to if you're curious to learn more about that side as well.
Outstanding. And Matt, it looks like we have about 15 seconds. Any parting words, any closing statements other than get started today?
Get started today. I hope this sets some urgency for you all. If nothing else, again, just to take action, learn more, read a white paper, whatever it might be. But I just want to thank you again for having me.
Oh, and thank you for being here. And thank everyone who joined us today for making the time. We're very grateful. We will absolutely follow up with the questions that we were unable to answer live today. We'll follow up with an email. I ask that as the webinar concludes that you stay on for a couple of minutes and complete the survey. Let us know how we're doing and what we can do better. Again, very grateful that you invest your time with us. Until next month, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.